one record from an official register, one blank space where an approval should have appeared, and a designation that had been repeated across newspapers, broadcasts, and state events for years. Camilla sat quietly as the legal panel reviewed that missing entry. She remained composed beside palace advisors while officials examined the paperwork. When the final decision was read aloud, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The ruling declared that the ceremonial designation attached to her position had never received the required formal confirmation. It was not suspended or withdrawn. According to the judgment, it had never been legally established in the first place. Today, I'll walk you through how that information surfaced and why the aftermath became even more damaging than the ruling itself. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Not the dramatic silence seen in films, but the kind that settles when experienced professionals realize a decision cannot be reversed. Camilla reached for a printed copy of the judgment and studied the opening section carefully. Then she read it again, keeping her hands firmly against the paper as though trying to absorb every word. Shortly afterward, a court official addressed her without using any royal form of address. It was not intended as an insult. There was simply no longer a recognized title available to use. In that moment, the significance of a title became impossible to ignore. A member of staff instinctively reached for the familiar wording used for years, only to discover it no longer applied. The Privy Council, the body responsible for giving formal force to royal decisions, had issued its findings in writing. Without its approval, a title remains little more than words on paper. The Council's ruling instructed palace departments and official officers to stop using the designation immediately. Before appeals could be discussed or documents updated, the effects were already spreading through the royal household. Staff members began reviewing correspondence, schedules, and records. The legal finding had moved from theory into reality. King Charles quickly indicated that the palace would challenge the decision. Witnesses later described his tone as determined, though not entirely confident. There is a difference between defending someone you care about and being certain that victory is possible. Then came a brief pause that many observers considered significant. When asked whether he wished to formally object to the ruling, Charles hesitated. It lasted only a moment, but in a room filled with experienced officials, that hesitation spoke volumes. As a husband, he wanted to protect his wife. As monarch, he understood the consequences of appearing to challenge established constitutional procedures. For a brief moment, he seemed caught between those two responsibilities. Royal titles often appear permanent. Years of public use, ceremonies, official documents, and international recognition can create the impression that a position is beyond question. Yet the judgment argued that repetition alone cannot replace missing authorization. No matter how often a designation is used, it cannot become legally valid if the required approval never existed. Camilla appeared to understand the wider implications almost immediately. The issue was no longer about how she would be addressed the following day. The ruling invited scrutiny of past decisions, appointments, and official actions connected to that title. At that stage, the discussion stopped being purely legal. Attention shifted toward a more troubling possibility. Someone within the royal institution had known about the missing authorization and eventually ensured that the evidence reached the appropriate authorities. As members of the royal party prepared to leave, Charles received a handwritten note from one of his advisors. 3 names reportedly appeared on it: Princess and Prince William, and a former official responsible for safeguarding key constitutional records. Camilla remained seated, carefully studying the ruling. She moved through the pages more than once, as though searching for a detail that might change the outcome. None appeared. The conclusion remained the same every time she looked. A court attendant approached and spoke to her using only her name. It was a small moment, but one that captured the reality of the situation. For years, formal titles had accompanied every introduction, document, and public appearance. Now, those familiar forms of address had vanished in an instant. The Privy Council's determination carried immediate weight. Once the findings were entered into the record, royal officers received instructions to discontinue use of the disputed designation. Departments throughout the household began reviewing correspondence, schedules, and ceremonial documents to ensure compliance. Even before any appeal could be discussed, administrative changes were already underway. Charles attempted to reassure her that the decision would be challenged. Those who observed the exchange later described a king determined to defend his wife, yet uncertain about the strength of the position he was defending. His frustration was obvious, but certainty was harder to find. A particularly revealing moment arrived when legal advisers asked whether he wished to formally contest the ruling. For a brief second he paused. The hesitation lasted only an instant, but in a room filled with constitutional experts and experienced officials, it did not go unnoticed. Some interpreted it as the visible sign of an internal conflict. Charles wanted to stand beside his wife, yet he also understood the risks of appearing to resist established legal procedures. That tension remained visible throughout the morning. For years, public perception had treated the title as settled fact. Ceremonies, official invitations, international coverage, and repeated usage had created the appearance of permanence. Yet the court's reasoning challenged that assumption directly. According to the judgment, repeated use could never replace missing authorization. A title printed thousands of times remained legally vulnerable if the original approval had never been completed. The implications stretched far beyond the present day. Questions immediately arose regarding previous decisions, appointments, and actions associated with the disputed designation. Officials began considering whether earlier records might require examination or clarification. Camilla appeared to recognize the scale of the problem almost immediately. This was no longer simply about a title. It was about everything connected to it. Attention then shifted toward another troubling issue. The court confirmed that information regarding the missing authorization had originated from within royal circles. Someone with access to internal records had identified the problem and ensured the evidence reached the appropriate authorities. This had not been the result of chance. Documents had been reviewed, concerns had been raised, and eventually the matter had moved into formal proceedings. Whoever initiated that process understood exactly what consequences could follow. As members of the royal delegation prepared to leave, Charles received a handwritten note from a senior advisor. 3 names reportedly appeared on the paper: Princess Anne, Prince William, and a former guardian of important constitutional records whose responsibility had been to oversee official approvals and state documentation. The king read the note carefully before lifting his eyes toward William. Witnesses later claimed that William offered no reaction. He neither defended himself nor attempted to explain anything. For many observers, that brief exchange became one of the most memorable moments of the day. The ruling itself had removed a title, but the deeper damage came from a growing suspicion that the challenge had not originated outside the monarchy at all. Instead, it appeared increasingly possible that the strongest opposition had emerged from within the institution itself. Behind closed doors, conversations quickly shifted away from legal language and toward personal relationships. Charles believed loyalty demanded support. William believed the institution required transparency, and believed procedures existed for a reason and should be followed regardless of personal consequences. Those competing priorities collided around a single issue, creating tensions that extended far beyond the courtroom. For Camilla, the loss felt deeply personal. The designation had represented more than rank or ceremony. It symbolized acceptance after years of controversy, criticism, and public scrutiny. It served as evidence that difficult chapters from the past had finally been left behind. Now that symbol had been placed under question. What disappeared that day was not merely a title. It was the certainty that had accompanied it. The legal ruling may have been delivered inside a courtroom, but the real consequences began afterward. As discussions moved behind closed doors, attention shifted away from constitutional language and toward personal relationships that had been strained for years. What had started as a question of paperwork was rapidly becoming a question of trust. Camilla now faced a possibility she had never expected to confront. The challenge that threatened her position may not have come from critics, journalists, or political opponents. It may have come from individuals within the royal institution itself. For decades, she had worked to secure acceptance inside the family. Public appearances, charitable commitments, and careful diplomacy had all contributed to building a place beside the king. Yet the events of that day raised an uncomfortable question. Had some of the people around her ever truly accepted her position? Charles reacted differently. For him, the issue extended beyond legal procedure. Recognition of his wife had become one of the defining goals of his public life. He believed years of controversy and criticism had finally given way to stability. The ruling threatened that belief. William viewed the matter from another perspective. His focus remained on protecting the institution itself. From his standpoint, ignoring legal concerns would create greater problems in the future. Public confidence depended on rules being followed consistently, regardless of who might be affected. Anne's position remained equally firm. She had spent much of her life defending procedures, traditions, and established standards. To her, rules existed to be respected rather than adjusted for convenience. These competing priorities collided at exactly the wrong moment. The emotional impact on Camilla became increasingly visible. What troubled her most was not the loss of status itself, but what that loss seemed to imply. For years, the title had represented validation. It symbolized the end of public hostility and the beginning of acceptance. Every official engagement, every ceremonial appearance, and every formal introduction reinforced the idea that she had finally secured her place within the monarchy. Now that certainty appeared to be slipping away. Meanwhile, Charles was struggling with his own disappointment. He had invested significant personal and political capital into securing recognition for his wife. The judgment suggested that confidence and determination may have replaced caution in ways that created unnecessary risks. As discussions continued, William reportedly met privately with his father. The prince argued that protecting the monarchy required acknowledging reality, rather than pretending the ruling had never happened. The conversation was respectful but difficult. Charles heard the words as a constitutional argument, yet many believed he also heard something else beneath them. A reminder of earlier moments when the institution had faced impossible choices between personal loyalty and public responsibility. Not long afterward, Camilla encountered and in a corridor away from the main gathering. The exchange quickly became emotional. Camilla wanted to know whether concerns had been raised before the ruling became public, and acknowledged that questions had existed but insisted she had neither controlled the investigation nor determined its outcome. Her response remained calm and measured. That calmness only seemed to deepen the frustration. Camilla expressed anger that warnings had not been communicated more clearly. She believed she had continued carrying responsibilities, while others may have been aware of unresolved issues surrounding the title. Years of patience, criticism, and sacrifice suddenly resurfaced in a single conversation, and listened without interruption. When she finally responded, she argued that authority built on uncertain foundations was always vulnerable. The statement was difficult to hear, especially given the circumstances, but it reflected Anne's long-standing belief that procedure could not be replaced by assumption. The discussion left a lasting impression on everyone involved. Soon afterward, another significant revelation emerged. William acknowledged that concerns regarding documentation had surfaced months earlier. Internal reviews had reportedly examined questions surrounding formal authorization, but the matter had never reached Camilla directly. That detail changed the atmosphere immediately. She discovered that discussions concerning the issue may have taken place long before the court ever became involved. For the first time, attention shifted away from the ruling itself and toward the decisions made during the months leading up to it. Who knew? When did they know? And why had those concerns remained unresolved? Those questions now mattered just as much as the judgment. What had begun as a legal dispute was evolving into something far larger. A story about communication, responsibility, and the consequences of ignoring warnings until they become impossible to avoid. The deeper investigators looked into the matter, the more complicated the story became. What originally appeared to be a simple question about authorization was gradually revealing layers of internal decisions, overlooked warnings, and unanswered concerns. Every new detail seemed to point toward the same conclusion. The controversy had been building long before it ever reached a courtroom. According to accounts from individuals familiar with the situation, internal records showed that concerns regarding the designation had circulated quietly among advisors months earlier. Several officials reportedly reviewed documents connected to the title arrangement and noted inconsistencies. Instead of becoming a public issue immediately, those concerns remained confined to private discussions. For a time, nothing changed. Public appearances continued. Official correspondence continued. Ceremonial duties continued. From the outside, everything appeared normal. Behind the scenes, however, questions were growing. Camilla remained unaware of many of those discussions. That realization proved especially difficult for her to accept. She discovered that conversations involving the legitimacy of the designation had taken place without her knowledge, while she continued representing the institution publicly. The person most affected by the situation had been among the last to learn about it. That fact intensified existing tensions. Further reports suggested that certain files connected to the matter had been reviewed under senior authorization before the case formally began. Those reviews raised additional questions about who had access to the records and what actions had been taken after concerns were identified. The focus was no longer solely on the title itself. Attention shifted toward the decisions surrounding it. Who examined the documents? Who raised concerns? Who chose not to act? Each answer seemed to generate another question. As discussions continued, emotions inside the royal circle became increasingly difficult to contain. Charles reportedly challenged William directly. He wanted to know whether constitutional concerns alone motivated his actions, or whether older family wounds still influenced his perspective. The question touched upon decades of history and carried far more weight than the words themselves suggested. William took a moment before responding. Those present later described his answer as measured and controlled. He maintained that the issue had begun with documents and procedures. Yet he also acknowledged that unresolved tensions within the family had existed long before the legal dispute emerged. The conversation revealed how closely personal history and institutional responsibility had become intertwined. What followed only deepened the divide. Many observers began revisiting earlier incidents involving disagreements over authority, responsibility, and public accountability. Events that once appeared unrelated suddenly seemed connected by a common theme: trust. The issue was no longer whether a title had received proper authorization. The issue was whether key individuals had trusted one another enough to confront the problem before it reached a crisis point. Meanwhile, new information continued to emerge. Records indicated that concerns regarding official wording had been raised during earlier private meetings. Some advisors reportedly questioned whether certain phrases carried implications that extended beyond ceremonial recognition. Those warnings did not receive unanimous support. Some believed the language created unnecessary risks. Others believed the concerns were being exaggerated. As a result, the matter remained unresolved. Looking back, many participants would later recognize that moment as a missed opportunity. Had stronger action been taken then, the courtroom battle might never have happened. Instead, uncertainty continued to grow beneath the surface. For Camilla, the realization was painful. She believed she had relied on assurances from trusted advisors and senior officials. The possibility that those assurances were incomplete or inaccurate, for questions that once appeared resolved were suddenly open again. Every conversation, every document, every decision. Each one became part of a larger picture. By this stage, the legal dispute had transformed into something much more significant than a disagreement over constitutional procedure. It had become a story about responsibility, communication, and the consequences of allowing uncertainty to remain unchallenged. And the most difficult revelations were still ahead. Months before the courtroom ruling became public, a private gathering at Windsor reportedly set many of the later events into motion. The meeting was not listed on any official schedule. No public announcement was made, and no media representatives were present. It was intended to be a quiet discussion among senior figures concerning future responsibilities and authority within the royal household. At the center of the meeting was a formal declaration. The document appeared straightforward at first glance. However, several individuals present noticed wording that seemed to extend beyond ceremonial recognition and into areas of practical influence. The language immediately attracted attention. One participant carefully reviewed the final pages and questioned who had approved certain provisions contained within the text. Those questions triggered a debate that would later prove far more important than anyone realized at the time. Supporters argued that the wording merely reflected an existing reality. Critics disagreed. They believed the language carried implications that required additional authorization before it could be considered valid. The disagreement remained unresolved. Despite concerns being raised, assurances were given that all necessary approvals had already been obtained. Those assurances appeared to settle the matter, at least temporarily. Camilla accepted those explanations. From her perspective, senior advisors and experienced officials had already completed the required reviews. She had little reason to suspect otherwise. The document proceeded forward. Yet not everyone left the meeting convinced. Several individuals reportedly continued examining the paperwork afterward. The more closely they looked, the more questions emerged regarding the foundations supporting certain provisions. One veteran official became particularly concerned. His career had been built around reviewing constitutional documentation and ensuring that procedures were followed correctly. After studying the declaration, he concluded that certain elements required further scrutiny. Rather than dismissing the issue, he preserved records and documented his concerns. At the time, few people paid attention. Months later, Those records would become critically important. Meanwhile, the declaration continued influencing decisions within the household. References to it appeared in discussions involving appointments, responsibilities, and organizational matters. As its influence expanded, so did concerns among those who doubted its validity. William's office reportedly raised objections on multiple occasions. Questions were submitted. Clarifications were requested. Warnings were issued. Yet supporters of the arrangement continued treating the declaration as though its authority had already been settled. The disagreement gradually intensified behind closed doors. Publicly, however, nothing appeared unusual. Events proceeded normally. Engagements continued. Official announcements carried on without interruption. Few outside observers suspected that internal disagreements were becoming increasingly serious. Then circumstances changed dramatically. Following the death of a key figure connected to the documentation process, records previously kept private began receiving renewed attention. Among those materials were notes, memoranda, and supporting documents that offered a clearer picture of how the declaration had been handled. Those records eventually reached officials capable of initiating a formal review. For the first time, concerns that had circulated quietly within private discussions entered an official process. Investigators compared declarations, approvals, and supporting documentation. The findings raised significant questions. More importantly, they revealed a timeline that differed from the version many people had previously accepted. Warnings had existed before certain decisions were finalized. Questions had been raised before public use expanded. Concerns had been documented before the controversy became public. The sequence mattered. Because once investigators reconstructed the timeline, the focus shifted away from isolated mistakes and toward a broader examination of how those mistakes were allowed to continue. For Camilla, this realization proved especially difficult. She believed she had relied upon professional guidance and official assurances. Discovering that concerns may have existed long before she was informed forced her to reevaluate the entire situation. Trust became the central issue. Not titles. Not ceremonies. Not legal terminology. Trust. Who provided information? Who withheld information? Who knew more than they admitted? Those questions increasingly dominated private discussions. By the time the matter reached formal proceedings, the controversy had evolved far beyond a dispute over paperwork. It had become a story about warnings that went unheeded, concerns that remained unresolved, and decisions whose consequences would eventually affect everyone involved. And as the investigation continued, even more uncomfortable truths were beginning to emerge. As the investigation expanded, attention shifted away from public appearances and toward the sequence of events that had occurred behind closed doors. Officials reviewing the records discovered that concerns had surfaced much earlier than many people realized. Internal warnings, draft documents, and private correspondence painted a picture far more complicated than the version presented publicly. The timeline became increasingly important. According to several accounts, questions regarding the authorization process had emerged before key decisions were finalized. Those concerns did not immediately trigger action. Instead, they circulated among advisors and administrators while normal operations continued. That delay would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire affair. Charles, determined to understand how the situation had escalated so dramatically, reportedly requested a series of private meetings with senior members of the family and key advisors. The discussions were intense. Everyone involved seemed to view the crisis through a different lens. Some focused on constitutional procedure. Others focused on loyalty. Others focused on accountability. Finding common ground proved difficult. One meeting in particular attracted significant attention. With no large group present and few distractions, participants confronted questions that had been avoided for months. Documents were examined line by line. Timelines were reviewed. Decisions that once appeared routine suddenly looked far more significant. As records were compared, differences between earlier drafts and final versions became increasingly apparent. Certain provisions had changed. Additional language had appeared. New authority had been implied. Those discoveries raised fresh concerns regarding who approved the changes and when they were introduced. For Camilla, the revelations were deeply unsettling. She had long believed that all necessary reviews had been completed before the documents reached her. Learning that key questions remained unresolved challenged assumptions she had trusted for months. The issue was no longer whether mistakes had occurred. The issue was understanding how those mistakes survived repeated opportunities for correction. William remained focused on transparency. He argued that public confidence depended upon acknowledging problems rather than attempting to minimize them. In his view, protecting the institution required confronting uncomfortable facts directly, and largely shared that perspective. Throughout the discussions, she continued emphasizing procedure, documentation, and accountability. Her position remained consistent from beginning to end. Rules only work when everyone follows them. That belief guided much of her involvement. Meanwhile, advisors began reviewing decisions connected to the disputed arrangements. Appointments, authorizations, and administrative actions were examined individually to determine whether additional steps might be required. The review process expanded rapidly. What started as a question about one document evolved into a wider examination of internal practices. Every discovery led investigators toward another file, another meeting, another unanswered question. The deeper they looked, the more interconnected everything appeared. At the center of the controversy remained a simple but powerful issue: trust. People trusted documents. People trusted assurances. People trusted that required procedures had already been completed. When those assumptions collapsed, confidence collapsed with them. For many observers, that became the true lesson of the crisis. The controversy was never solely about titles or technical procedures. It was about what happens when uncertainty is ignored because addressing it seems inconvenient. As public attention intensified, pressure mounted for a clear resolution. Officials understood that delaying decisions would only prolong the damage. The institution needed certainty. The public wanted answers. And those directly involved wanted the situation brought to an end. By this stage, the original dispute had transformed into something far larger than anyone anticipated. It was now a story about leadership, responsibility, and the consequences of relying on assumptions instead of verification. The final outcome would not be determined by ceremony or tradition. It would be determined by facts. And those facts were becoming impossible to ignore. By the following morning, what had begun as an internal dispute had become a national story. Newspapers rushed out updated editions. Television networks reshuffled their schedules. Commentators, historians, and constitutional experts all focused on the same question: how had the situation been allowed to reach this point? Yet the most significant development came from inside the palace itself. After days of review, meetings, and difficult conversations, a final decision was reached. There would be no appeal. The legal ruling would be accepted. That decision changed everything. For months, advisors had argued over procedures, responsibilities, and competing interpretations of the documents. Now the debate was over. The institution would move forward under the court's determination rather than continue a lengthy public battle. The announcement immediately shifted public reaction. Attention moved away from speculation about future court challenges and toward the events that had led to the controversy in the first place. Questions about internal decision-making, oversight, and accountability dominated discussions across the country. At the same time, a wider review of procedures was ordered. Officials began examining approval processes, administrative practices, and documentation requirements to ensure similar disputes could not arise again. The objective was simple: restore confidence and prevent future uncertainty. For Charles, the outcome was deeply personal. He had spent years trying to secure stability around an issue that had followed him for decades. Instead, he found himself confronting the reality that good intentions alone could not replace proper procedure. For William, the conclusion reinforced a principle he had defended from the beginning. Institutions remain credible only when they follow their own rules. For Anne, it confirmed something she had argued throughout the crisis. Ignoring concerns never makes them disappear. It only makes the eventual consequences larger. And for Camilla, the experience left a lasting mark. The controversy had challenged not only a title but also years of assumptions, assurances, and expectations. In the end, she chose not to prolong the fight. Rather than continue a public confrontation, she accepted the outcome and moved forward. That decision surprised many observers. Some expected further legal challenges. Instead, the conflict ended with acceptance rather than escalation. As the final reports were completed and administrative changes implemented, the broader lesson became clear. The crisis had never been solely about one document or one designation. It was about what happens when questions go unanswered, warnings are ignored, and assumptions replace verification. Institutions depend on trust. Trust depends on transparency. And transparency depends on the willingness to confront problems before they become impossible to hide. When the story finally reached its conclusion, the most important outcome was not who won or who lost. It was the reminder that authority remains strongest when it is supported by clear procedures, honest communication, and accountability at every level. The controversy may have begun with a missing approval, but it ended with a lesson that will likely be remembered long after the documents themselves are forgotten. And with that, the chapter came to a close.